Hi, I'm Othais, and this is yet another foreign name that I am going to butcher, but let's try it anyway. Ratanakosin so nunroi ni sete. I am attempting to say the RS-121, the Siamese Mauser. So, before you get to complaining in the comments, let's get it over to the light box. With an overall length of 49 1/8 inch and weighing in at 8.4 pounds, this is definitely what you would think of as a traditional infantry rifle. The magazine capacity is 5 staggered cartridges fed from a stripper clip, and that is of course the 8x50mm rimmed Siamese cartridge, otherwise known as the Type 45. This is a very unique situation because we do not really see modern Mausers with rimmed cartridges.
This is your friendly neighborhood May, reminding you to please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. If you really enjoy our content and want to directly contribute, please consider supporting us over at Patreon or Subscribestar, or you can buy some swag from our C&Rsenal shop. Thank you all.
Before we get too deep into the history of this particular gun, I need to clarify a bit about the research around it. You see, the Siamese, or more recently known as Thai Mauser, made its way into the US collector's market back in the 1960s at a time that little information was available. And a great many attempts at explaining this gun have resulted in a number of variant histories. Now, I actually don't mean to disparage any of these, as collector-driven data and speculation can often be the heart of these sort of oddity research arena, right? Now, as time has passed, many previous assumptions have been thankfully able to be dismissed, but others have been more reinforced. So what I'm about to tell you today is currently the best vetted information available, but the research is still often held together by somewhat more tenuous threads than we're used to. So this is another grain of salt episode where hopefully more data will emerge in years to come. All right, good. Let's go ahead and dig in. This is Siam, or rather it was. Since the middle 1800s, it had been losing more and more territory to British and French colonial aggression. Siam's independence, however, was secured precisely because of these two powers' poor relationship. Both empires preferred to leave the little kingdom as a buffer state between their claims. Unfortunately, they weren't really leaving it in one piece over the long run. Siamese political strategies mostly involved balancing cautiously between the two foreign powers, but their monarchs knew this situation couldn't go on forever, so while placating both France and Britain, they quietly attempted to modernize the country, which is really no small feat. Catching up technologically, economically, and militarily with the West was a huge endeavor, and it was especially hampered when you couldn't really do it in full view, or at least without making both feuding powers feel that they needed to have equal access to what you were doing and how you were improving. These attempts to remain independent and grow resulted in a number of unequal treaties where foreign politicians and businessmen were not really subject to Siamese law, nor was Siam able to effectively tariff imports. Still, slow progress was made, most of it under the oversight of largely one single king. Chulalongkorn, born September of 1853, son of King Mongkut and Queen Debsarindra, he was raised with as much Western education as possible through the use of tutors, chief among which was an Indian-born woman whose memoirs would be fictionalized into the novel Anna and the King of Siam, and the musical The King and I. In 1867, King Mongkut would lead an expedition into the Malay Peninsula. This was part of his own experiment to confirm calculations about what would be the solar eclipse of August 1868. While on the journey, both he and his son would contract malaria, though only the younger would survive. So at age 15, Chulalongkorn would ascend to the throne, although this is a photo from his second coronation in 1873. But it was during this event that he took the title Rama V, the fifth of the Rama dynasty. Even before the title was in place, however, our new king was busy. From 1870 through his second coronation, he actually toured as many British-administered colonies as possible and took careful notes as to how they were run. He would prove to be an energetic reformer, and one of his first acts was to overhaul the tax policy, removing corruption and streamlining the flow of funds so that the kingdom could afford to modernize. Now, many of you will know that you can't just change the order of things without a reaction, and so Rama V would face a wild array of internal confrontations. I won't be going into those details today because we need to sort of fast forward. What we care about is firearms. Now, Siam's first old muzzleloaders would actually have come from Portugal, but they soon fell in line with the British. Enfield rifles, Snyder breechloaders, followed of course by the Martini, and then curiously, the Winchester 1873 and the German Mauser 1871. Hold up, something's different here. You see, thanks to that weird balancing act between France and Britain, Siam was finding it harder to get any significant arms contracts, at least not for, really advanced guns. So they had to start turning to countries that didn't have a stake in their own future. The US briefly, and then Germany, and as we'll see, Austria. Because in 1890 they would adopt the Mannlicher 1888, with records showing 4,000 shipped from Steyr. Another 6,010 Mannlicher 1890 infantry rifles would follow, along with 1,000 1890 carbines. Unfortunately, those 11,000 modern shoulder arms would not be enough to put themselves toe-to-toe with the French. Well, mostly not enough. In 1893, the French Third Republic would take offense at Siamese officials ousting opium smugglers, honest French merchants. The situation spiraled, which was probably the French hope from the start. This devolved into a series of skirmishes, and from there the French sent 3 infantry columns into the Siamese regions east of the Mekong River, claiming the lands belonged to Vietnam, which conveniently belonged to France. I think you guys are seeing this, right? Now, the troops eventually met Siamese resistance, and unfortunately for Siam, one of its officers was extremely competent, launching a successful raid against the enemy. Normally that would be a good thing, but suddenly not feeling so secure on land, the French Navy would decide to get into the action, sailing right on up to Bangkok. And honestly, having your palace accessible to the sea when you don't really have a navy isn't a great idea when you're dealing with colonial powers. In the end, Laos would be ceded to France, and while we're looking at the map, I'll point out the extra nibbles that would carry on until 1909, just so you can see. Siam is very interested, obviously, in staying both out of wars with French or the British, but also desperately attempting to develop its own armed forces because one day they might really need them. And on that front, I have to be clear, a lot of historians point out that Siam may have been doing something akin to self-colonizing. There's a theory out there that a large part of the support for colonization came from a feeling of being able to civilize the world. We even see this when we talk about the Krag Jorgensen, right? If Siam could show its own modernization to various nations of the world, it reinforced its political capital that could be spent on remaining independent. So while yes, they wanted the best arms possible, that doesn't mean that they thought of it as a core solution to their problem in this sort of head-on-head combat idea. It was actually more of a, look, we're modern too, what are you doing? We have our own rights. Now that said, they still bought 1,616 more Mannlichers in 1899. These were now the model 1895 Stutzen. That seems to have been a bit of a stopgap because by 1900, Siamese military officials were seriously looking for a new rifle design entirely. They hadn't been exceptionally happy with the straight pulls. Notes say that they reviewed 18 different shoulder arms, but I'm unsure of what all was seen. I can say they ranged from the near-obsolete Japanese Murata to the Danish semi-automatic Madsen rifle. That's quite a spread technologically, but they ultimately came up with 3 key points that they felt must be included in any firearm considered. It must be a bolt-action rifle, no straight pulls. The bolt must lock open when the magazine is empty, and there must be a handguard, particularly behind the rear sight for handling when the gun is warm. Honestly, this really reads like the Mannlichers somehow wronged them. While all that was cooking, they actually got to looking for ammunition as well. Initially, the only restriction was that it be between 6.5 and 8mm in diameter, but the larger bore size won in the end. The result would be an 8x50mm rimmed, bottleneck case, bottle-nosed bullet, smokeless powder. Wait a minute. For all they hated the Mannlicher, they absolutely ripped off its cartridge. The dimensional differences between the Type 45 cartridge and the original Austrian 8x50mm rimmed cartridge are nearly insignificant. Now, that's probably for good reason, because it appears that you can just feed 8mm Austrian and 8mm Siamese interchangeably, at least the first cartridge. They can work, so like the Thai cartridge can work in the original Austrian guns, The Austrian ammo can work in the new Thai Mausers. It seems very likely that they were interchangeable in the guns, which would be good because that would mean Siam could keep using its Mannlichers or their old ammunition while taking on a new rifle. However, there is still a lot of confusion around the Siamese cartridge. Documents from 1913 seem to suggest a higher muzzle velocity, one almost identical to the Austrian cartridge, which would make sense, especially if you wanted to keep the rifles sighted as was. Except, pulling the ball and powder from extant examples of this cartridge, we find a bullet of identical weight to the Japanese Murata, and a similar powder weight as well. It would make sense that Japan wanted to reuse existing components and data, but it would also suggest a lower velocity, which we also find in period records like those from DWM. So the history on this cartridge is a bit muddy. Now, I'm fairly certain that the cartridge was decided before the final rifle choice, which ultimately came down to two considerations. The Japanese Arisaka Type 30 rifle was available from a power with a vested interest in exporting to Siam. Japan had been courting a relationship with the nation as a means to provide itself a market for finished goods and an ally against Western encroachment. Japan had rapidly modernized. However, in this period just before the Russo-Japanese War, it was hard to say if they could actually stand toe-to-toe with the foreign powers. The other interesting rifle was the Swedish Model 1894, or at least that's how it's recorded in the one source that I have. The length feels a bit suspect considering our gun today, but maybe that's what they had on hand and started the pursuit. I find it more likely that Siam ultimately saw an early version of one of the Mauser export rifles, like the later 1907 that would be sold to China. The features line up much better with the final product. Anyway, Siam ultimately favored the Mauser system. Japan would make one last bid by offering up their very latest Type 35 rifle, a gun still being spun up for production. They even sent over an example in the Siamese cartridge, but it was no use. The Mauser was the ticket. Now, if only Siam could buy any. You see, Mauser Obendorf had its hands full with military contracts at home and was taking on more Ottoman orders to boot. Shopping around Europe for other producers likely resulted in more concerns. You have shipping costs, security of the shipments, integration of Siamese inspectors, but above all else, you have this deep concern for secrecy. And that would be very hard to ensure in Europe. Most Western powers had a lot of leaky talk around their arms factories, especially whenever export markets were involved. Salesmen really like to panic one power with threats of another power arming up. So just look at South America for examples of that, right? Siam wisely negotiated a solution, a way to have their cake and eat it too. They would have Japan produce their Mauser licensed rifle. The deal would actually be struck with Mitsui Bussan Kaisha, a venture capital firm founded in 1876, which actually remains in business today. Mitsui shipped a lot of product and had their own ships, as a matter of fact. They would be liable for the deliveries, but also collected 1/3 of the contract price up front, the rest being paid on receipt of the rifles. Production would be carried out at the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal, which is also where some hybridization seems to have occurred. Features from the then brand new and still in production Japanese Type 35 naval rifle would be grafted onto the Mauser. I'd list them all here, but I think it's more fun to show you them in person. Now, this is not our gun for today, but I really wanted you to see it first. This is the 1907 Mauser, one that we've actually covered in a previous episode, but Mauser 98 locking action, the usual sort of like floor plate, semi-pistol grip stock, rear stock, coming forward to a nice big old handguard that stops midway up, that sort of notched barrel band, spring retaining it, coming on forward, spring retained front barrel band with the Mauser style of locking lug for the bayonet, cleaning rod, unprotected front sight. You get the idea, right? At the rear, we've got a tangent rear sight with a push button slide adjustment. All right, usual stuff. This is so bread and butter, you guys are completely used to it, but this is the export Mauser. This is what Mauser was selling to a lot of countries around the world as the out-of-the-box military rifle, all right? So, Siam comes up with this, which, if we really look at it, all right, metal butt plate, all right, semi-pistol grip stock, lower sling swivel here, coming into a nice even grip, right? And then plain features, finger groove, trigger guard, although the magazine releases changed, more on that in a moment. Tangent rear leaf sight with push button. handguard halfway up, that even the little crease in the barrel band, right? Spring retention on the barrel bands, flat style barrel band with the lug. This is a reproduction cleaning rod, but cleaning rod here, and then unprotected front sight, right? All right, so yeah, it's a Mauser 1907 export. I mean, just on the face of it, 98 action. This one's a straight bolt. Most of the Mauser 1907s were. The one I have happens to be turn bolt. But yeah, perfectly straightforward, okay? When it comes to those sights, by the way, just so that I don't skip past it, these guys had a 0 of 200 meters and can be adjustable up to 2,000. And of course, we had that beautiful tie marking on the side. And let me see if I can show you the top. Yeah, look at that gorgeous writing. I can't read a lick of it, but gorgeous writing. And then where does this thing really start to differ? The most notable change is here, this dust cover, which is taken straight off the Japanese Type 35 rifle. It has a thumb latch here, and then you just push. And as you push, I don't know if you saw that, it will naturally expand away, which frees it from this little hole here, and there's a spud on there, and it just slides forward very naturally all the way up and exposes the action. So you can't really shoot it with this cover closed. I mean, you can fire one, but you can't extract because it's going to get stuck in there. But this does allow you to seal up the gun when you're not in combat. And, you know, in Southeast Asia, yeah, it's a pretty important feature. That's why Japan went for it. That's why they'd carry on something that was more like this, but more automatic in the Type 38. And it's probably the same reason that Siam was interested. Now, you can see the relief, by the way, for that feature right up here. While I've got you at the top of the gun, I want to cover some markings. We have a Royal Seal and RS-121. I'll show you those in more detail and explain them in a bit. In the back, this is where your serial number would be written. And another piece of Japanese influence is this plum-shaped bolt handle instead of a round one like we're used to on the usual German Mausers. This is very Japanese looking and pretty comfortable to the hand. Otherwise, this is a bog standard 98 Mauser action, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it. Let's see if I can, however, show you another interesting feature. Get the bolt out of here. And while I still have this particular camera angle, you're probably gonna notice something very interesting, which is that the receiver comes back to a point, and then there's a separation and then an added tang. That's because not all of the RS-121s have this tang. Most do, because it was a later edition, and we're gonna talk about why in a moment, but that is another Japanese addition. This is very much from the Arisaka lineage of rifles. Deep tang, top and bottom. Another Japanese feature is here, the floor plate release, which, hey, that's much easier than shoving in the bullet tip and moving it back or forth. This comes right away, although it's not hinged, so this is something you want to keep an eye on. Obviously, just like the Mauser and the Arisaka, we've got the V-flat spring with the follower here. This is an interrupting follower, so this gun does lock open on empty. Locked open. And depress the follower, and we're back in there. So, pretty cool. That, of course, being a Mauser feature, this particular one being Japanese. Another Japanese feature is one that you might not be able to see unless you're paying attention to the grain boundaries on this particular rifle. There's a seam here. This is a two-piece stock. Not all of them will be. Again, it sort of depends on certain factors that I'm going to talk about in a moment, but two-piece stocks can be found on the RS-121s, again, a Japanese edition. Also, not really Mauser, not really Japanese at this time. Let me get to the back. We have a butt trap. Now, most researchers believe that because this is so shallow, that it was designed specifically for the muzzle cover and not much else. Now, we usually don't get this deep, but I've gone ahead and taken out the floor plate on this gun because I want you to see the steep rake on this magazine. And that exists because of the rimmed cartridge. We don't see rimmed ammunition in export Mausers, in modern Mausers, you know? That's something we think of in the black powder guns. But here we are. In this case, they solved the problem of rim lock by just making sure that as you fed cartridges into the magazine, the first ones in go to the rear because they're gonna be the last ones fed. So the rims are always set in the right position. I've never suffered rim lock on this gun, but admittedly I've put very few rounds through it given the sort of oddness of the ammo. But apparently it worked well. I haven't seen any reports of deep complaints, and it's a fairly simple geometric solution. Although, boy, it seems to take up some extra space. I mean, look at that overhang. It's pretty wild to look at, and it allows for the follower to have to kind of travel in this really catty corner position. And at the top, you'll find that these have a fair bit of waggle room, more so than other export Mausers that you might see. I should also point out that I am not going to be doing a full bolt disassembly or any of that because it's exactly the same as the 98. However, Siamese Mausers do not share parts compatibility with German Mausers because these were made in Japan. They were not sort of done on the exact same equipment. They were not as religious to the interchangeability with other countries, because why would they? This is Siam's rifle. It only needs to be interchangeable with itself. All right, let's take a look and see how this thing works on the inside.
While generally a Mauser 1898 action, the first unique feature of the Siamese RS-121 is its sliding dust cover, which we must press open before loading. While hidden from the outside, the steeply raked double-stacked magazine well is the second major change from a standard Mauser. This shape forces each cartridge significantly rearward as it enters the magazine. That way, the next cartridge's rim always stacks to the front, preventing rim lock when feeding. Otherwise, this really is a bog-standard Mauser 1898, although none of the parts will interchange with German production. The gun is locked by two symmetrical lugs at the front of the bolt body, which must be turned manually before you can withdraw the bolt. Here, we have the firing pin, which is constantly being pressed forward by a concentric coil spring, but is held back by the affixed cocking piece, which is, in turn, held by the tipping sear. Pulling the trigger causes it to first brace both of its upper bumps on the underside of the receiver. This is the first stage of the pull. Any further, and it leverages the sear downward, releasing the cocking piece and firing the rifle. This action is cock on open, which means the cocking piece is cammed back as we open the bolt. The mechanism is simple, a set of opposing diagonal planes, one on the cocking piece and one on the bolt body. When we bolt home, the cocking piece again snags the sear, coming back just a little bit further. The cocking piece rides inside a larger cocking shroud, which also carries a safety flag. Manually turning the safety 180 degrees rotates a semicircular plate into the path of the cocking piece. This plate has a sloped surface, which presses the cocking piece slightly rearward, disengaging it from the sear. The tip of the safety is half cut, and when on safe, it turns into the bolt body, preventing it from rotating and therefore locking the bolt shut. Rotating the safety back frees the bolt body to move and rests the cocking piece back on the sear, readying the gun to be fired again. The RS-121 uses the long Mauser extractor, which pulls the spent casing into the spring-loaded ejector, flicking the spent shell from the action. The magazine feed is powered by a simple flat spring, which presses upwards on the milled follower. When empty, the follower rises high enough to block the bolt from being pressed forward, indicating to the shooter the need to reload. This time, let's go back to Othais.
Now, normally we'd be handing this right over to Mae for some shooting, but I have to tell you that this isn't the original Siamese Mauser. No, this is actually the second one, and this has caused a lot of confusion for collectors along the way. The first contract with Japan called for 20,000 rifles. Production was started in May of 1902 and finished in November. The rifles cost Siam 65,000 pounds sterling. Now, that 1902 date is critical to understanding something. You could call this rifle the model 1902, right? That's what we would do in the West. Well, in Siam, they use the Ratanakoskan calendar, which takes its year 1 from the accession of Rama I, founder of the Chakri dynasty, and the founding of Bangkok. This was, however, in April, so there is some offset from the Gregorian calendar. So the first contract would be in the Siamese RS year of 121, making this the RS-121 rifle, but it doesn't stop there. Siam had a religious calendar based on the death of the Gautama Buddha, and without getting into too much detail, it would become the official state calendar in 1913. That put the 1902 contract in the Buddhist year of 2445, which would be abbreviated to Type 45. Okay, got it? Good, because I'm going to ruin this further. Like I said earlier, this is not the first rifle, so therefore not the model 1902 or the Type 45, but this is an RS-121 because history hates you. Actually, this is one of those Springfield 1903 things. Recall, the US had adopted the Springfield 1903 short rifle with its spike bayonet and .30-03 cartridge in 1903. Then they modified it in 1905 and changed the cartridge in 1906, forcing a major overhaul and rechamber program. What did they call the new 1906 model? The Springfield 1903, of course. So, much less severe, but a very similar issue here. You see, having received the first contract, Siam noticed some issues, and Japan was happy to help resolve them in the second contract. Started in May of 1903 and finishing in November, these 20,000 additional rifles now made for a total of 40,000. This time, Siam only paid 60,000 British sterling pounds. So, what were the changes? Well, you've technically seen them all because the gun I have here is from the second contract, but let's review. Being that this is a second contract gun, it has all of the features, thankfully, because some vanished due to re-arsenaling, but looks like we're all original here, so let's take a look. We've got, just like I showed you before, the addition of these tang extensions, all right? So that gave us a stronger wrist for the lighter wood, which is probably the same reason why we got the two-piece stock, again a feature I showed you, but specific to the second contract. However, you may find second contract guns that were later refurbished to have single-piece stocks, or vice versa, so don't get too worried, these guns again re-arsenaled a lot. While I'm at the back of the gun, a unique feature to the second contract is actually here at the top of the butt plate. Original guns had a more normal export Mauser flat butt plate with a slight curve at the top that came in at this sort of 45-ish degree angle. That was found to be pretty weak, especially probably during drill, and so they changed it over to a 90-degree straight on in through the top with a deep tang on the butt, so also stronger. If we move up to the front of the gun, as soon as we can get there, a minor detail is that these little wing-a-dings on the side of the front sight, once zeroed, were milled down. They were milled down as flush as possible. In this case, this one's been adjusted again, and so it's a little proud, but these should only on a type or a second contract gun, they should only be a little bit in and out, whereas on the original first contracts, they stick out pretty far, and then were never sort of fitted after adjustment. Gave you a lot of room though for being able to fix your windage, huh? Oh, now, there's also some evidence that the handguards changed. However, my gun being a mismatch, I don't know for sure. The handguard does not match the stock, does not match the bolt. Again, re-arsenaling programs, but supposedly some, if not all, of the second production run have reinforced metal tabs where they would be meeting up under here or up under here especially. You may even see rivets to go with those. I believe that's how they were fixed. Unfortunately, I don't have an example to show you, but that is a possibility. Okay, so we have two slightly different rifles, and like the US, Siam doesn't really change the name. They are both marked effectively RS-121. This is written in Thai on the receiver, underneath a sort of royal seal. The outer ring is a depiction of a flaming ring, the chakra, a mythical throwing weapon, which is actually the basis for the name of the Chakri dynasty. Chakri meaning the holder of the chakra. That pyramid-looking thing with the sunbeams, well, that's the Great Crown of Victory, part of the regalia of Siam. So this is very much equivalent to the chrysanthemum seal on the Arisaka. So the two contract rifles had the same base markings, carried on the same serial block as a matter of fact, and were considered basically the same model despite their differences. That's not too confusing until you get into that whole year change thing. Since the Model 1902 moniker is really for collectors, let's call the second contract the Model 1903 just to keep our heads straight. And that same reasoning would appear around 1913 in Siam, as with the adoption of the Buddhist calendar, so came the occasional reference to a Type 46 rifle, which, by the way, became the standard pattern for whenever guns saw significant repairs. So many Type 45s would turn into Type 46s, at least under our current understanding. So there you go. Years of collectors' arguments probably solved, because who knows what will turn up next. You may have a Type 45, you may have a Type 46, you may have a Type 45-46, and it's going to get worse from here. Anyway, now because I know some of you are going to ask, there is a way to tell whether or not your gun was in the first or second contract. Just check the serial number. Over 20,000 and you started with a Type 46. Under 20,000 and you started with a Type 45. Oh, are you having some trouble reading that? Maybe don't want to have to translate those numbers? Well, check the sidewall of the receiver under the dust cover. Here you'll find an inspection mark. Probably. There are only two for the RS-121. This is from the first contract, and this is from the second, and they actually seem to tell us a little more about the rifle's history. That first mark, well, it comes from the first letter of the name of one Prince Boande. The second is likely a stylized symbol for the Siamese army, so not sure who got to do the second contract, but back to the prince, because his story is fairly interesting. I'm not even going to try butchering this guy's full name. All you need to know is that this noble of Siam was recently promoted to lieutenant colonel, like right as the first contract started. Apparently, Boande was sent along with another lieutenant colonel, Chitade, to the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal in Japan in order to inspect the Mausers under production. The route they took was circuitous and anonymous. They traveled dressed as civilians, avoided conspicuous hotel stays, and once in Japan, they favored renting a small house way out of the way of prying eyes, and even came and went from the arsenal without a stitch of official dress. Both men were apparently English speakers, which came in handy since one of the lead Japanese engineers also knew the language. Kijiro Nambu, who had been the driving force behind the Type 35 rifle and likely had been involved in the Siamese Mauser. As a matter of fact, it's a personal theory of mine that Nambu drew inspiration from the Siamese contract, especially given the number of Mauser features that found their way into the Type 38 rifle. I mean, the tooling was basically already there for him to tinker with. Now, returning to the point of secrecy, all that effort was expended so that the British and the French couldn't find some excuse to get their dander up and interfere with the rifle deliveries. Either power would not like the other players helping Siam enforce its own sovereignty. Once completed, each delivery of rifles was essentially smuggled into Siam. Again, this was made easier with the involvement of the Mitsui Company as a front. Alright, both rifles are in hand, and now we can let Mae finally shoot this particular one.
This rifle normally uses a stripper clip. However, we were sadly unable to find one, so it's single loading for me.
What an absolutely beautiful gun, and thankfully the differences between this one and the earlier Type 45 are so low that we really didn't need both to do this episode. There's going to be almost no handling differences. However, we did miss out on something because there was a third original Siamese Mauser. Starting in February of 1904 and finishing in July, 10,000 carbines would be cranked out by the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. These cost the Siamese government 25,500 pounds sterling. Because of the clear difference from the rifle, these were designated RS-123, which was later converted to the Buddhist year Type 47. It's interesting to note these were apparently called short rifles in Siam, as they didn't have a dedicated word for carbine. Now, the photo I'm showing you is actually a mock-up, an estimation I've made with available images and a description of the original carbine, which sported a 20 1/4 inch barrel, lacked a bayonet entirely, and had a unique magazine release in front of the floor plate, and a rear sight zeroed for 300 meters that could be dialed up to only 1,500 meters. These guns have the same chamber markings as the rifles, however the numbers below spell out RS-123. Alright, we have discovered 2 long rifles and a carbine, 50,000 guns in total, and apparently millions of rounds of ammunition. which was initially made in Japan, but German machinery was purchased for domestic manufacture, making Siam fairly independent on this front, a very wise investment. Now, despite the new arms, Siam still ceded territory to the British and French through 1907, on into 1909 really, as we saw earlier. The two colonial powers had actually managed to reasonably settle their differences, however, in 1904 with the Entente Cordiale. That had mixed implications for Siam. In October of 1910, King Chulalongkorn succumbed to kidney disease, leaving the throne to his son, Vachiravu. Educated in Britain and having been enrolled in the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, he was briefly commissioned in the Durham Light Infantry. Studying law and history at Christ Church, Oxford, he did fail to graduate due to appendicitis complications. Vachiravud traveled Europe extensively and then on to the US and Japan before returning to Siam in 1903. Rising to king in 1910, he would prove to be a military reformer, introducing the rank of general and field marshal. From here, I'll skip the details, but it's obvious that the new king would introduce a number of British-styled institutions and practices to Siam. Most notable for our story, he would form a paramilitary corps, one independent from the established Siamese army. This started as a ceremonial guard, but given his experience in the British army, it quickly took on a role of its own. It was even augmented with an equivalent Boy Scout subsidiary. As further proof of British influence, he would arm his new Wild Tiger Corps with the short magazine Lee Enfield rifle. This would become the Type 62 in Siamese service. While neat, still not exactly making friends. Actually, even before the rifles showed up, Vachirov would experience his first but not last coup. In 1911, the Wuchang Uprising in China led to the fall of the Qing dynasty and emboldened radical elements in Siam. This, combined with the snubbing of the army, led to many young officers planning an end to the monarchy. Unfortunately, they chose their assassin by lottery, and the short straw guy decided it might be better to just snitch on the rest rather than go through with it. Despite dodging the coup, the new king learned a lesson and put a lot of work into further integrating the Wild Tiger Corps with the regular army. Once World War I began, however, this force was largely put to home guard and support work, with the army doing army things. Now, speaking of the war, Siam was not in it, at least not at first. Instead, the Siamese government was largely frozen. They had spent so many years navigating neutrality, it became the standard go-to political philosophy. But the king and other high officials were getting impatient. They clearly favored the Entente, but many of the younger officers had been German trained or otherwise had sympathies to Germany or the Central Powers. Best to just ride this one out if they could. Didn't need to turn the entire internal government upside down over it. That is until German unrestricted submarine warfare were declared. Well, actually, no, even this didn't initially get Siam to move at first. Instead, the king wisely started to ready his nation into accepting entering the war. Propaganda was prepared, and the king himself even wrote some detective stories that made the Germans out as the baddies. This brought the public around and helped buffer and quiet those small number of young officers. So, when the US declared war, Siam was able to follow along with their own declaration on July 22nd of 1917. Thanks to planning, German businesses and most importantly ships, which had been hiding in neutral Siamese waters since 1914, were now quickly seized. Notably, the French and British would come along after to demand anything that floated belongs to them. Honestly, seizing the Germans in Siam was probably the only real use of this rifle during those war years. As for the actual battles in Europe, well, Siam actually would send in an expeditionary force. This is actually weirdly a whole other story, really. Just know that's because they would use French equipment, and therefore this aspect of Siamese history doesn't really directly touch on our story today. And the whole endeavor didn't really do a lot for Siamese-French relations either. However, there was one glaring success. Siam sent over several hundred pilots, which is actually really impressive for the time. Despite having almost no navy, Siam boasted a small air force, as the king, along with Prince Chira and Prince Chongrabose, were all absolutely enamored with flight. So Siam had an air base and some planes before the war even broke out. And one more, however, the Siamese pilots' training was fairly elementary, especially since they had not received any experience from combat pilots. So on arrival to France, they were sent for months of retraining, which ultimately meant that they did not see any active duty before the end of the war, like their grounded brethren actually did. Now, for Siam, though, that training was exceedingly valuable, and they would continue to pour resources into aviation, which actually does have a bit to do with our story today, specifically the Siamese ammunition. That's because in 1923, Siamese military officials would adopt an improved Spitzer round, which, while nice for infantry, was an even greater boon to aviation, allowing their machine guns to shoot straighter and therefore more predictably in flight. The new cartridge appears to have been designed to require minimum work on the available firearms, and to permit use of previous ammunition inside of the rechambered guns. The Type 66 shoulder is much further up with a shorter neck. That means you could not chamber it into a Type 45 bored rifle or machine gun. However, you could put the old Type 45 ammo into a Type 66 bored rifle or machine gun. You'd just blow out the neck a little bit. The other dimensions of the case were increased slightly, just enough so that when reaming for the new ammo, each rifle would get a freshly recut chamber. Faster, flatter shooting ammo, however, meant changing the sights. Or you could just trim down the sight base, I guess. So much so that the original numerals were cut through, so at a glance you should be able to tell which chambering you have on hand, although I'm unsure if any of these sights were missed later on. They do not appear to have redone the receiver markings at all, so checking that sight base is key for understanding what cartridge should be chambered in your gun. Now, the new cartridge wasn't just adopted for improving the Mausers, it was actually part of another rifle contract for a whole new rifle. The Arisaka Type 38 derived Siamese Type 66 rifle, which is actually fairly cool. I mean, it's a Type 38 with a tangent rear sight. 50,000 would be ordered from the Japanese Pacific Union, an export firm, again made by the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. Now, I do not have one here, and it's not even the gun for our show today. Sorry folks, but that 1923 adoption date coincided with something quite terrible: the Great Kanto earthquake. This incredible quake all but leveled Tokyo and severely disrupted Japanese rifle production. Actually, it would result in the reform of the arsenal system as a whole. But for Siam, it meant their rifle was delayed a few years. Delivery stretched from 1924 to 1928, versus the original very quick deliveries of the Mausers. Just a note here, King Wachito would fall ill and pass away in 1925. He left only a daughter, just a few hours old, also a metric ton of debt, so the crown would have to pass through his brother. And this guy saw a lot of tribulation, but it actually has a lot less to do with our story today, as we're finally sort of decoupling from the imperial family. Returning to the shoulder arms, it's interesting to note that there was never a Type 66 carbine. Instead, it appears that every single one of the Type 47 Mauser carbines were converted to the new Type 66 Spitzer cartridge. These became the 4766 carbines, which in addition to the new chambering and shortened rear sight also received a new forward barrel band as they were adding bayonets. This band is now based on the Arisaka pattern and takes a Japanese 1903 style of bayonet, although the point is a little different. An additional purchase of 5,000 extra bayonets in 1928 seems to bear this claim out. This program was likely due to the financial crisis that was enveloping Siam and honestly much of the world at that time. Alright, so Siam has a new rifle. Old rifles are likely getting slowly updated to Type 66 pattern. Not all of them ever would though, as you can tell. The carbines though, they really got overhauled, like all of them. Would any of these guns, all of them combined, see any actual service? Well, none in the Revolution of 1932, which was a bloodless coup that introduced a constitutional monarchy to Siam. This was actually something the king was already kind of planning on, so he just kind of rolled with it. However, the very next year, our friend and former rifle inspector Prince Boandej would lead another, albeit unsuccessful coup, known as the Boandej Rebellion. Rallying aid in the provinces, the prince would demand the return of some powers to the crown. Neither the rebels nor the government really wanted to square off, and the situation remained precarious until blows finally started to be struck. Interestingly, the king remained neutral, as did the entire Siamese Navy. Ultimately, the fighting did have to start, and this meant that the Mausers and later Arisaka would finally see some direct action. In addition to machine guns, armored vehicles, and especially artillery. In the end, Bolande would be defeated, although not before sending an empty train smashing into another being sent down the tracks with government reinforcements on board. Wow. Ultimately, his forces would scatter and Prince Bolande would flee to Vietnam and then Cambodia. He would return home in 1948, however, and died in 1953 at the age of 76. Through all of this, it appears more and more carbines and rifles were being converted to the new Type 66 cartridge, and it appears around 1936, they ran out of carbines especially. Again, in more modern armies, short rifles are favored over long. It's estimated 3,000 Siamese Type 4766 carbines were therefore made new in Bangkok, which appear to have continued production into 1940. These will have a unique crest with a simplified chakra, and now feature 4 rings instead of the crown. These rings are said to represent the 4 traditional armies of Siam. The characters now spell out Chor Sor 4766. At least a handful of new-made rifles have also been noted, these being marked similarly as Type 46, with no addition of 66. I'm not sure why. Now, it's a pretty curious thing, but the 4766 carbines are actually almost overwhelmingly the only ones you will see in the US market. I'm unsure why the original RS-123s or their converted versions never really made it over here. Now, while all of that was being produced, Siam underwent some changes. Plek Phibun Songkram, mostly known as Phibun, thankfully for my horrible pronunciation, had been one of the leaders behind the 1932 revolution. In December of 1938, he rose to Prime Minister of Siam and established a military dictatorship. Dang it. In June of 1939, he would officially change the name of the country from Siam to Thailand, Land of the Thais. This was part of a broader nationalist program and carried a somewhat anti-Chinese sentiment at the time. After the outbreak of World War II, Phibun saw France crippled militarily by the successful invasion of Germany. This was Thailand's chance to reclaim some territory, and with the Japanese invasion of French Indochina in September of 1940, anti-French rallies were held in Bangkok, and several border skirmishes erupted along the Mekong frontier. These eventually evolved into an air war, which again goes back to that earlier investment that Thailand had made into dominating the sky in its region. In January of 1941, Thailand launched proper ground offenses into Laos and Cambodia. The former went well, and the latter bogged down for a fair bit. However, French counterattacks in both failed, and so they turned to their old secret weapon, the Navy. After decisive French victories at sea, the Empire of Japan stepped in to mediate the matter, negotiating an end to hostilities. I mean, technically, France was Vichy France at that point, and they were sort of an ally? Anyway, later on, Japan would overwhelmingly invade Thailand and made it a de facto puppet state for the rest of the war. From here, Thai soldiers and their rifles would be fielded into Burma and Malaya. Since Japan ultimately lost the war, Phibun would be ousted, and Thailand briefly returned to being Siam before he returned in 1948 and made it Thailand again in 1949. Now, from there, the story of our rifle actually falls right off the cliff, because post-war Thailand would adopt the 30-06 cartridge, and while it has been said a few of these might have been converted to it, it probably was very difficult given the rimmed nature of the original gun. Thailand was much happier with US surplus and the more easily converted Arisaka. So, in the 1960s, these guns would be surplus, make their way to our collector's market, where they continue to baffle and confuse American collectors today. Now, just a couple of notes while we're on the topic of the collector's market. 1. It's almost impossible to find an all-matching Siamese Mauser. They underwent a lot of rebuilding programs thanks to serving in hot, wet conditions. 2. Many guns were converted to 4570 in the US, thanks to its similar rim size and more available ammunition. Be careful and always cast the bore on any of these guns before firing. There could be any number of wildcats as well. 3. A number of shortened rifles have shown up in the market. There doesn't appear to be a consistent pattern with these, and they are likely not an original military design, although we are not entirely sure. Siamese Mausers have been very popular for sporterization, so modification is practically the norm when it comes to this particular rifle in the market. All right, I think that's got us covered. So let's go ahead and put this in Mae's hands and see how she feels about shooting one of the most beautiful Mausers I've ever seen. All right, gang, we've made room for one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in this world, and Mae.
Yeah, I knew that wasn't me. I already knew.
How do you feel handling the Siamese RS-121 second contract, making it the Type 46 Mauser? Boy, this is a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a title in and of itself. Actually, this one we have kind of had around the house for a while, but I can't say I've handled it a lot. Didn't you pick this guy up personally a while ago?
I think I found that before I ever met you.
No.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You had a few guns before you met me.
Yeah, but this is an early one for me. So this is my RS-121.
Yeah.
I bought it easily in the first 5 guns that I ever bought.
Did you know what it was when you got it?
Yes-ish, as much as anybody could at that time.
Okay.
I believe the reason I knew anything about it was because of bolt-action military rifles of the world. I was a very early collector then.
And that was a pretty good first book to start on.
Yeah, and all I know is I bumped into it for a low price at a gun show, and I noticed that the rear sight was intact, which at the time I did know that that meant that it was not updated to the new cartridge and that that was a less common thing to find.
This long tangent sight down here?
Yeah, well, the rails for it.
Oh.
So you could see the full characters. So that made me grab it. And then I've just sort of had it since then. And I don't know, I've just always found it to be a beautiful gun. And actually, I never even got to shoot it until this episode. It had some light surface cracking in the wood. So that had been, I mean, I did my best to glue and patch that. And it looks like it didn't separate at all. So
Yeah, it looks like it held all right.
But this was one of the few occasions where I get to, shoot my own gun. It's been a long-term project because these are so poorly understood. For those of you who just watched the episode and never heard of them, congratulations, you skipped a lot of suffering. Because
On your part, having to try to find that information,
It used to be the whole thing was like, well, the gun's the Type 46, but the ammo's the Type 45, but no, there is a Type 45 gun, but no, there's not.
But then there's a 45, 46?
Right.
Yeah.
So that hopefully it's a lot clearer now that there's a 45, 46, 47, and then 45's got upgraded to 46, and then all of them got upgraded to 66.
Carbine.
And then you don't even get into the part of like, well, is it Siam or Thailand? But like, just so hard to just name a gun. Whenever you see the long gun, unless you've accidentally wandered into one of the very, very rare long rifles that were produced in Bangkok.
In the 40s, right?
Right,
Yeah.
like in 1940, essentially.
Oh, okay.
Unless it's that one weird gun, you're probably dealing with an RS-121, and that's the safest way to talk about them. But let's go with the Mae route. Why don't you describe this gun for us?
So, all right, hear me out on this one. We've got effectively a long...
Yeah, I think it's 50 inches or so.
Yeah, long rifle. Balance is pretty decent just in front of the mag. We got a semi-pistol grip. Pretty decent long finger groove. Not a full stock, but at least a decent size handguard on this guy. And then we've got this Gewehr 98 action. I'm not going to lie, if you take off the dust cover, this kind of just looks like an export Mauser.
Yeah, it's definitely an export
it's like the 1907. It really is in a lot of ways.
You can tell that Siam went to the international market and tried to purchase a rifle, and and it's interesting because the history that's available to me is that they started with the Swedish 94, which might tell us, it may come out that they were researching their guns a little sooner than we thought, because you cannot tell me that they did not just go out and purchase an export Mauser license.
Pretty much.
The problem is they couldn't get them made overseas, so they had to have Japan make them. So none of the parts that I know of are interchangeable between these two guns, despite how similar they are. Here, let me set this down. And actually, technically, what I was holding was a 1907, and this came a little before that, but they were already trying to sell those that early on.
Yeah.
It's just that it took a few years for these to start actually selling. So you have what is essentially very early export Mauser styling with...
a dust cover.
Yeah, but before we get to that, really tell us what's on it, because some people might not have seen the export Mauser episode. We got semi-pistol grip stock, mostly full-length stock, half-length handguard. What's up with the rear sight?
Yeah, we've got this tangent rear sight with a barleycorn front sight, which that's a pretty clean read to me because it's a decent V-notch, like opposite.
Not
triangle
ideal, but good.
side. Yeah, it's okay. It's not bad.
Flat, it's not interrupting your aim.
No, and it's definitely not going to get easily damaged. Like this feels pretty stout. Like it's pretty resilient, I think.
And this is a cock-on open Mauser 98 action.
Yep, with a flag safety in the back. All things that we're quite used to.
Now this is a gun...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just because you're talking about safety.
Sure.
This is a gun that underwent a lot of refurbishment over the years. And that usually means something when you deal with Mauser flag safeties.
Really?
Turn that safety. Let's see. Oh, like butter. Okay. Because you see the Spanish guns go through the same thing, right? And the Mauser flag safeties on those and the Argentines and all the other stuff, they're usually horrible because they've worn down. So Siam apparently paid close attention to their tolerances
Yeah, they're
when
not
they did
bad.
this.
Really isn't. And there's a nice thumb relief here for thumbing in your rounds pretty easily.
Yeah, if only we had some sort of stripper clip apparatus for
That
it.
would have been nice. Unfortunately, they're like stupid rare and expensive.
I tried getting a hold of one. I tried getting a hold of at least what I thought would work. Because
It's probably like the first time you've ever, like, it's just come up that it just ran out of time. We're able to get a hold of one.
I couldn't do it. No, we got someone was claiming to have one. I knew it wasn't one on looks, but I thought dimensionally it would work. And the problem is, even when I got it sort of modified to work, it desperately needed to have the little bubbles on the side in the right place to keep it from tipping, because the rimmed round, when you try to stripper a rimmed round, there's a lot of energy that gets pulled forward, and so that clip has to be anchored so that it can't tip, and so I just could not make a replica that worked.
That's fair.
Yeah. I know somebody's going to offer me one now, but we already did the episode.
Yeah, you can get like 2 emails at least, but like, yeah, I've got some of those.
Okay.
That's how that works.
All right, so I guess now we can get to the most daring thing about this gun.
Just the dust cover. It's just so unique. I mean, we've experienced dust covers before. I mean, usually they've been integrated, though, in such a way that they follow the bolts.
Yes, but we've had the advantage of working from the future to the past.
This is true.
Because
we've been to the future. We know what it can be.
This gun came out before the Type 38. Couple years, right? And then at the same time as the Type 35, which is a gun we're actually hoping to cover. We've had one on offer.
Ooh, that'd be fun.
Yeah, it looks like a Type 30 with some differences to the safety, quadrant rear sight, and this sliding dust cover is really what you see. So this steals that from the Type 35.
Okay.
And then after this and the Type 35, Japan goes, we need it to stay with the bolt because it's a separate hand motion.
It really is. So I could see, and it doesn't take much to operate it. It barely takes any force to actually unlock it and then be able to pull it up and down. Like it really does. It does click into place too. Like it's a little tiny lever that obviously has a small notch that you can easily lift out in order to push it up and down and settle it in.
I found for closing it, I have to kind of consciously lever it and pull it back. But for opening, I just put my thumb on there and push forward.
Oh, really? Is that just because because if you think about it, the motion of the push forward, it automatically will rise much easier. No, I get that. That's fair.
So,
which would be fantastic for needing to get off in a hurry.
Right. They're not going to accidentally fight with it. It's just going to go.
Right.
It could cause some confusion, though. The fact that it's not attached to the bolt itself.
Just because you think in a hurry someone could go to open or try to manipulate the action, then, oh no, you've only got your one shot.
Yeah, there's nothing about that dust cover that locks the action.
No.
So you can cycle the bolt. I mean, in this case, your follower is going to get in the way if you go all the way back.
Oh, yeah.
But
in there.
if you had rounds in there,
I did that.
You could, in theory, cause a big old jam because you could fire one, eject a spent casing into the cover, and then try to feed forward, not realizing it.
And it's not gonna. I don't see that rim hiding anywhere up in here. It's definitely gonna get stuck in the action.
Right. So you could get a mess. It's almost a liability in that sense, which is why you see Japan go to the sliding dust cover that stays with the bolt, and then we've seen a couple sliding dust covers that were then they were basically adaptations of the Japanese system.
Yeah, like the Governor 98 did one.
Yes, that one was very complicated to integrate.
Yeah.
We also saw remnants of one on the later Berthier's where they were designed to have one, but then it was never really issued.
I actually didn't get to play with that, but I saw Ian had one at one point to play with.
So those are much smarter because they stay with the gun. But this one, it's a separate hand motion.
So I could see that coming into, or being an issue, like in the heat of the moment kind of thing, where it's like they might forget to take it off.
Yep.
But if you're needing to transition between areas, that can be really convenient just to have it here and not have to worry about manually taking it off and putting it anywhere. It's always here with the gun.
There you go. So this is something we've never really talked about on our show, which is action covers. Because I guess we're so used to the sliding dust cover from the Arisaka perspective that we think of it as an integrated rifle component. But actually, this sliding dust cover is taking the place of something that is usually with the rifle, but with it, not on it.
So with you, it just comes with the rifle, and then you're responsible for holding on to the separate thing.
Right. And if you look at action covers from the World War I era, a lot of them are canvas or leather with buckles, like 1 or more, maybe 3 buckles, right?
Ew.
Yeah. And
that
so
could be complicated and take time to take off.
Right. So you have a rifle with you that you can't put into action without removing this leather cover. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and I mean like buckling a pair of boots, like trying to get in there.
Yep.
So that means that once you're up at the front or in somewhere that's a dangerous area, which are usually the areas where you have the least cleanliness, the most dirt, mud,
sand,
water, whatever the case may be, the worst conditions are also often the conditions in which you're actually fighting, and you have to make a decision to uncover your gun.
Yeah.
That can be very hard to know when you're supposed to take, because imagine you're sitting, because it's always when you feel safest that you have the worst defeat, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're sitting around with your dust cover on, and somebody else shows up.
Well.
Imagine having a gun that you can't use because you're fighting these straps, right? What do you do with this gun?
Well, at least with this one.
Yeah, versus fighting straps. All right, Mae. Surprise!
Well, it would be nice if I could do it in a hurry in the one moment that I was planning on using it, but apparently I'm the one person that's going to do that. It's me with the freaking Modern Liquor 93 all over again.
As slow and awful as that was, it was still better than taking 3 buckles off of some cover.
Don't even. I'm going to get so much crap for that.
Which would you choose, though?
I would still pick this.
Yeah, I'm frankly surprised this isn't a more common feature at that time.
It could be really convenient. And on top of that, just considering some of the conditions that, a lot of the players are in.
Making your troops feel safe using protective equipment for their gun is also going to preserve the gun better.
Yeah.
So, smart all the way around. I actually rather like this for how uncomplicated of an addition it is.
Yeah, effectively all I'm looking at is covering that up. If I've got a strap, I just strap this onto my back. I'm already ready to go.
Yeah,
that's it. I'm done.
It's one little training point, and otherwise not a very dangerous thing to add to the gun. It's not causing a lot of confusion. I like it a lot.
Yeah, very straightforward.
I guess we talked about the cover enough, but
yeah,
hey, it's
we don't need to talk about the gun at all.
So, yeah.
To be fair, we did pretty much talk about it because it is effectively what we said. It's an export Mauser, and aside from the fact, the only other difference really is that it's got a rimmed cartridge. It's a rimmed 8mm cartridge, which it's, in terms of recoil and experience, is not unlike that 8x50 Austrian that we shot before.
I mean, it is almost identically the same cartridge.
Yeah.
The recoil on this feels a lot like an 1895 Mannlicher.
Yeah. The only thing I thought was that I expected the rim on the cartridge to give me a little more grief, and that I thought maybe it might cause a jam or anything like that, but the only issue we really had was just the fact that with this one in particular, we had one issue with it, but it wasn't even because of the cartridge that was with it. It was because of an issue with rim thickness.
Yeah, we had hand loads.
Yes.
And in doing the hand loads, we found out you have to be extremely tight on the thickness of the rim.
Yeah.
Because of the angled feed and the fact that the follower can walk back and forth, when you get to that last round, you can get into a situation where it doesn't like to pick up the last round unless you have the correct dimensions on that rim. Mm-hmm. And so we found that to be a potential issue, and we had to put our best rims towards the bottom of the magazine.
Yep.
But if you had normal ammo that was issued with it, it would have worked fine.
Exactly. But that was because that's then. Right now, we're having to deal with what we can.
So overall, how would you rate a gun like this?
I mean, it's a really ingenious design. It truly is. It's an export Mauser, and don't get me wrong, it's a bit long and cumbersome, and I could see myself wearing out with it a little bit, but the cartridge is still decent. I didn't really experience any issues with it, and it comes with a dust cover. That's pretty secure. It's pretty solid for a rifle.
Yeah, I wish we had gotten a hold of one of the carbines, because I feel like...
That I would like to try.
I'm curious if the Siamese carbine would have been enough to be in your top 10, top 5,
Yeah.
Because then you're dealing with the cock on open, Mauser 90.
How long are those? Do you know off the top of your head?
It's a 20-inch and some change barrel.
That's not bad.
Yeah, no, it's going to feel a lot better, but the problem is you're going to have more recoil.
True.
And you're going to have that. Again, I think the rim cartridge is a little awkward in terms of, there's just something a little awkward about loading it from the stripper clip. Mm-hmm. I know we didn't get to do it on air, but I was tinkering with one, and just the fact that it wants to pull and flop around weird.
I'd be curious to see how the originals did with it, if it actually did hold it really tight.
The interesting thing is you take this dust cover and you put it on, say, a 7mm export carbine, and I would call it probably one of the best versions of the Mauser you could have.
Yeah.
But nobody did that.
No, surprisingly not.
Yeah. Well, if you got a Bubba at home, I guess go nuts, because it's a
right.
Bubba. But don't ruin a good gun. There, I did my duty.
Good job.
All right. Well, any other final comments on the Siamese?
No, I'm actually happy that this one's staying around, and hopefully you'll be able to play with it some more since now.
Yeah, I actually finally got to shoot the thing.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? How did you actually enjoy it?
I was working. I was just glad to see it shoot.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know. I just enjoyed it. To me, it's just one of the most beautiful guns I have because there's something about being able to take all this sort of busyness of the Mauser and just tuck it calmly away. And you get this smooth space age. I can't do it from over here.
Yeah, apparently you're having a hard time.
Well, it's because you munked it up.
It's all jammed down.
What did you do?
I didn't do anything.
Yeah,
there
see?
we go. You just got to do it with some force.
Perfectly smooth, no problems.
Shh, it's fine.
Make can ruin anything.
I mean, maybe. It's like, wait, hold on.
No, it's very space age though with that on there. It's very svelte.
Yeah,
I like it.
It's really rad.
All right, well that's gonna have us wrapped up. I don't have to thank anybody. I own a gun.
Yeah,
I own
thank
one
yourself.
gun. Yeah. Take that, internet. I managed to own a gun by buying it before I did the episode on it years ago.
Yeah.
When I had some money.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you'd like to help out with that, don't forget we have ways you can do that, which you can find at the end of the show.
Yeah. Thank you.
Also, any updates after the credits. Anything else, Mae?
I think that's pretty much it. I think we covered it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Later, everybody. Special thanks for research on this episode goes out to our own Space Cowboy, who has conveniently been keeping an updated article on Surplus. So, if you're watching this later on, maybe check in and see if there have been any new discoveries. Also, special thanks to Francis C. Allan for his years of work on this topic. He's definitely been an inspiration to niche researchers thanks to his articles through Bonsai. Maybe we can bully him into a proper book on Siamese small arms.